If you have spent any time on the internet in the last few years, you've probably noticed that autism is being talked about a lot differently than it used to be. More adults are being diagnosed, and more people are describing their own experiences and recognizing themselves in those descriptions. And the clinical picture that most of us grew up with was built around a very narrow set of observable traits in children and is being revised in ways that material change what autism actually means. This video will be about what the science currently says and the actual mechanism, what is really happening in the nervous system, and what that means for the people who are autistic. I'm Elizabeth. I'm a licensed professional counselor with a background in neuroscience and biology. This is Quirky Apes. So let's get into it. The DSM, which is the diagnostic manual that clinicians in the United States use, defines autism spectrum disorder around two primary domains. The first is a persistent difference in social communication and social interaction. And the second is restricted, repetitive patterns of behaviors, interests, or activities. And to meet these criteria, those differences have to be present across multiple contexts, traceable to early development, even if they were unidentified at the time, and cause meaningful functional impact in the person's life. That definition is accurate as far as it goes, but it has several limitations that have become a lot more visible as the research has developed. And understanding them is part of understanding what autism really is. The first is that the DSM definition was built largely from research that was conducted on those children, and for a very long time, primarily on male presenting children with profiles visible enough to get flagged in school settings. Adult presentations can look very different. Presentations in people who were socialized female can look very different. Presentations in people with high masking capacity, which will matter later in this video, that looks differently enough that even clinicians trained on the original research frequently miss it entirely. This is a significant part of why so many people reach adulthood without a diagnosis or with several incorrect diagnoses that accumulated along the way. A second limitation is that the definition is very behavioral. It describes what is observable from the outside without really describing the mechanism underneath it. A behavioral definition can be very useful for identification, but it doesn't really give a good framework for understanding what autism actually is. It tells you what to look for in a clinical encounter, but it doesn't tell you what is generating what you're looking at. The third limitation is that the definition was constructed within a framework that treated neurotypical presentation as a standard against which autistic presentation was measured, which meant differences from the standard were classified as deficits. More recent research has substantially complicated that framing and, in some areas, completely reversed it, particularly as autistic researchers entered the field and the questions being asked changed accordingly. Let's talk about the neuroscience. Autism is a difference in how the brain processes information, a consistent profile of differences running across sensory processing, social cognition, executive functioning, and attention allocation. Each of those is worth understanding on its own terms. First, sensory processing. The autistic nervous system tends to process sensory input with less automatic filtering than neurotypical nervous systems do. In neurotypical brains, a significant amount of incoming sensory information is screened out before it ever reaches conscious awareness. So, background noise, the feeling of clothing against your skin, peripheral visual movements, ambient smells, the flicker of fluorescent lights, the brain decides that most of that's just irrelevant and attenuates before you even register it. That filtering runs automatically without deliberate effort, and neurotypical people have no real experience of what it would be like without that. However, in many autistic nervous systems, that attenuation is less reliable. More of the sensory environment gets through and it arrives at a higher effective intensity. The nervous system ends up doing considerably more processing work than the environment expects it to be doing, which generates a load that is invisible to everyone who is not carrying it. The profile's not uniform across people or across sensory channels. Some autistic people are highly sensitive across multiple modalities simultaneously, and others are sensitive in some domains and hyposensitive, undersensitive in others, meaning that their threshold for registering certain input is higher rather than lower. And they may even seek out intense sensory experiences because those experiences feel organizing and regulating. What is consistent across the variation is that the sensory environment costs more to process, and that cost accumulates across days in ways that add up. The practical consequence is that an environment that reads as neutral to someone whose sensory filtering is operating at that very typical efficiency is a high demand environment to someone whose filtering is not. An open office floor plan, for instance, or a crowded social event, the fluorescently lit waiting room, these generate continuous processing load for the autistic nervous system that is genuinely not visible to neurotypical people sharing the exact same space. Now let's talk about social cognition. Social cognition is one area where autism research has shifted more substantially over the past couple of decades, and where the older framing has done the most damage. The original model, which dominated clinical and research thinking for a very long time, characterized autism as a disorder of social cognition in which the autistic people were deficit in their capacity to understand and to model others' mental states. The term mind blindness was used quite often. And the implication was that autistic folks lacked something that neurotypical people had, and this lack explained their social difficulties. But more recent evidence, including a very significant body of research conducted by autistic researchers with autistic participants as active collaborators rather than just study subjects, tells a much more complicated story. What the current research describes is a difference in how social information is processed rather than a deficiency in social interest or social capacity. Autistic people tend to process social information explicitly and effortfully rather than implicitly and automatically. Reading a facial expression, tracking the subtext of a conversation, navigating the unspoken social rules of a given context, these processes happen more consciously in autistic processing than they do in neurotypical processing, where much of this is running in the background without deliberate attention. The downstream effects are very predictable. Social interaction is more tiring because it requires more active cognitive management. Real-time conversation is harder because it demands simultaneously processing the multiple information streams that the people around you are handling without even thinking about it. Misreads can happen more frequently because implicit cues that most people are absorbing automatically might require deliberate decoding in real time under social pressure while managing everything else in parallel. There's a concept called double empathy. The double empathy problem from Milton, which comes from autistic led research, reframes the social mismatch in a very important way. The original deficit model assumed that communication breakdowns between autistic folks and neurotypical folks were located in the autistic person. The autistic person was the problem. The double empathy research found that there is a breakdown that's bidirectional. Neurotypical people misread autistic people, miscues, and make incorrect attributions about intent and emotional state. The mismatch is mutual, and what was previously attributed entirely to autistic deficits turns out to reflect, at least in part, a difference in communication style between two groups that read their own group more accurately than they read the other group. And that's a meaningfully different picture from the one that shaped clinical practice for most of the 20th century. Now we're going to touch on executive functioning, and that refers to the cognitive processes that manage goal directed behavior, like working memory, cognitive flexibility, planning, initiation, inhibition, and self monitoring. Autistic people show consistent differences in executive functioning, though the profile varies considerably across each individual and doesn't affect all of the domains equally. For most adults, the area with the greatest functional impact is initiation. Getting a task started, particularly a task that lacks external structure or immediate urgency, can require substantially more effort than the task itself. The prefrontal circuitry responsible for generating that initiation signal has to work way harder to produce it. And sometimes it can't produce it at all until those conditions shift. This is the mechanism underlying autistic inertia. Cognitive flexibility is also frequently affected, meaning that the shifting between tasks or between mental sets costs more than it does for most people. Unexpected changes to plans carry a much higher processing cost, not because of inflexibility in the personality kind of sense, but because the nervous system is absorbing the cost of a high demand operation that it was not given the preparation time for. Working memory differences appear consistently as well, affecting the ability to hold and to manipulate information while simultaneously doing something else, which compounds the social processing picture considerably, since real time conversation requires exactly that capacity. Okay, now we're on to one of my favorite topics, monotropism and attention. One of the least discussed, but more functionally significant features of autistic cognition is how attention and interests are distributed. The term monotropism describes a tendency toward deep, focused attention on a narrow range of interests or tasks, rather than a broad distributed attention across many. The attention system pulls strongly toward whatever it is engaged with, and it resists redirection, not by choice, but as a consistent feature of how autistic attention allocates itself. This produces what most people recognize as special interests, which are areas of intense and sustained focus that generate detailed expertise and serve genuinely regulating and restorative functions. What is less commonly discussed is that monotropism also explains a significant portion of the executive functioning picture. Getting started on a low interest task is hard partly because the attention system is built to go deep, and shallow, low interest tasks run against the grain of how it operates. When an autistic person is in a monotropic flow state, their processing capacity, verbal output, problem solving ability, and general functioning tend to be substantially higher than when they are asked to distribute attention across multiple low interest domains. This is why the same person can appear highly capable in some contexts and absolutely struggle significantly in others. The difference is frequently not the skill or the effort, but whether the task is engaging the attention system in the direction it runs well. Now we're on to masking. And masking is the process by which an autistic person monitors their own presentation and suppresses or replaces it with behavior that reads as neurotypical in a given context. It can include suppressing stimming, which is the self regulatory movement and behavior that helps the nervous system manage sensory load and emotional state. It includes scripting social interactions in advance, forcing eye contact that really doesn't come naturally, mirroring others' body language and affect, and performing the expected emotional responses while managing how you are coming across in real time on top of doing everything else that you're already managing. Most autistic people who grew up without a diagnosis developed masking as a learned adaptive survival response more than a deliberate strategy. The environmental feedback was consistent and was clear enough. The way you naturally present does not work here. The nervous system just found workarounds to that. And those workarounds became automatic over years of repetition. And the cost of them remained invisible because the behavior they produced looked functional from the outside. The research on masking documents a consistent relationship between high masking and elevated rates of anxiety, depression, and burnout, including specifically autistic burnout. Autistic burnout is distinct from general burnout, and it is characterized by a loss of previously functional skills and capacities. It is what happens when the cognitive and emotional resources that are required to maintain that mask over years are no longer available to the person, and they lose access to the abilities they appeared to have. This is regularly misdiagnosed as the emergence of a new psychiatric condition rather than recognized as the predictable endpoint of sustained high masking under high demands. The relationship between masking and late diagnosis follows directly from this. People who mask effectively are frequently not identified as autistic because the clinician cannot see the features they are looking for. What is visible is the person who appears to be managing. What is not visible is the cost of that management or the state of the person once they leave that room. Setting the neuroscience aside for a moment, it is worth talking about what it actually means to have grown up autistic without knowing it. In environments that weren't designed for how your nervous system works, the nervous system is constantly taking in experiences and constructing meaning from those. That meaning accumulates into the frameworks through which future experiences are interpreted. For an autistic person who grew up without a framework that accounts for their neurology, the meaning constructed from years of difficulty, from social misreads, from exhaustion with no visible cause, from apparent failures at things other people seem to manage without visible effort, those all tend to settle on the person rather than on the fit. It becomes, I am too sensitive. I am too intense. Something about how I function doesn't work correctly. And those interpretations are the predictable outcome of someone constructing meaning from their experience without access to the information that would have produced a different interpretation. The environment was generating the difficulty. The nervous system was responding to that accurately. And the only framework available located the problem in the person, understanding that the problem was located in the fit between the person and the environment requires information about the person's neurology that was not available. This is why an adult diagnosis or an accurate understanding of autism in adulthood tends to produce a specific kind of response. It's not just relief that there's a name for it, but it's a reprocessing of history. Experiences that were filed under personal failures start reading a lot differently when the mechanism is understood. The social exhaustion had a specific cause. The sensory overwhelm had a specific cause. The difficulty with transitions and initiations, they had a specific cause. That reprocessing takes time. Understanding the mechanism intellectually and integrating it into how you actually experience yourself can be two different things, and they can happen on very different timelines. The second requires something more than information. It requires repeated experience of the new framework holding up when tested against real life. Now let's look at what autism is not, because significant inaccurate information is still in circulation. And it's worth being direct about what the current research does and does not support. The narrative that autistic people lack empathy has been studied and does not hold. What the research describes is a difference in how empathy is processed and in how it is expressed. Many autistic people experience affective empathy at a high intensity, absorbing the emotional states of others strongly, and sometimes without the ability to regulate that input. The expression often does not match neurotypical empathy expressions, which has produced misreads in both directions. But the evidence doesn't support any absence of empathy. The claim that autism is caused by vaccines traces to a single fraudulent study that was retracted after data fabrication was documented and whose author lost his medical license. The epidemiological research on this question is extensive and it is consistent. There is no causal relationship. Autism is a lifelong neurological profile. What changes across the lifespan is the accumulation of learned strategies, the shifting of environmental demands, and sometimes the degree of masking. The underlying neurological profile does not resolve. The spectrum designation exists because the presentation varies substantially across individuals in intensity and in profile and in the specific areas that are most prominent. Two autistic people can present in ways that look very different from one another, and that reflects a genuine width of the spectrum rather than a difference in how autistic either person is. The research on the outcomes in autism is heavily confounded by mismatched environments, late or absent diagnosis, and the cumulative effects of masking. When autistic people have accurate information about their neurology, reasonable environmental fit, and support calibrated to how their nervous system actually works, the picture looks substantially different from what earlier literature described. Let's look at that mismatch frame. The shift from a deficit model to a mismatch model actually changes what the problem is, which is useful in changing how the intervention looks. A deficit model locates the problem in the person. The autistic person is measured against a neurotypical baseline, and the differences from that baseline become the targets for that intervention. The cost of that intervention in terms of masking, suppression, and allostatic overload of sustained performance that doesn't match how the nervous system actually works, it's generally not part of the calculation. The mismatch model, however, locates the problem in the relationship between the nervous system and its environment. When the environment's demands exceed what a given nervous system can sustainably provide, the result is overload, depletion, and the downstream symptoms that eventually bring someone into treatment. The question shifts then from how to change the person to how to change the fit. That can mean modifying the environment directly, like reducing sensory load or restructuring schedules, changing communication formats, maybe building in recovery time that is actually sufficient. But it can also mean changing the framework through which that person interprets their own experience. And that can reduce the additional load generated by years of inaccurate self narratives. Both are necessary. Changing the environment without addressing the accumulated meaning of years of struggle can leave a person with better conditions and a still intact belief that they are fundamentally deficient. Addressing the narrative without changing the environment can leave a person with much better self understanding inside conditions that remain totally unsustainable. The goal is an accurate understanding of how the nervous system works, an environment with enough fit to be sustainable, and a framework that locates difficulty where it actually originates. The science of autism has moved substantially over the past 2 decades. The behavioral checklist is still in use because it is what we have for identification, but the research underneath it has shifted. The deficit framing has substantially been revised. The double empathy findings have reframed the social picture. Autistic led research has changed what questions are being asked and what counts as a valid answer. Described accurately, autism is a consistent neurological profile that processes sensory input, social information, and cognitive demands differently than the environments most of us live in and were designed to expect. The difficulty that it produces is real. The exhaustion is, and the history of misread and apparent failure is real. The mechanism generating all of it is specific, documentable, and has nothing to do with care. Well, thanks for joining me on this episode of Quirky Apes. And if you or your organization could use an LPC, a coach, or a consultant, or if you need some training from someone who thinks like this, I am available. And if you want some free resources or to learn more about neurocontextual design or therapy, go ahead and visit creativesolutionscoaching.com or find me on the socials.